"This is a fake," the maid's daughter declared in flawless Arabic. Words that would save a billionaire sheikh from losing $250 million. The sophisticated scam targeting one of the world's wealthiest men unraveled because of an unlikely hero from the most unexpected background. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. High above the shimmering lights of New York City, John Smith surveyed the Manhattan skyline from his penthouse of glass and marble. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the urban tapestry below, a reminder of his position at the very pinnacle of American wealth. Tonight, the businessman was poised to sign what his team called the deal of a lifetime. His fingers drummed against the mahogany conference table, where an ancient-looking document lay unfurled, its edges curling slightly under the soft recessed lighting. "This will cement your legacy for generations," whispered Michael Brown, leaning in close. The advisor's expensive cologne mingled with the scent of old parchment. Around them, 5 other men in tailored suits nodded in agreement, their collective anticipation filling the room like a physical presence. The document before them promised control of mineral rights worth hundreds of millions. John's expression remained impassive, but a flicker of hope crossed his tired eyes. At 58, he had built an empire, yet something about this particular acquisition felt different, more personal, more significant. In a shadowed corner near the kitchen entrance stood Mary Smith, a 10-year-old girl with observant eyes and a blue dress worn thin at the elbows. The maid's daughter clutched a leather-bound journal to her chest, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her mother, Jennifer, had been clear about staying out of sight during important meetings, but curiosity had drawn her from the safety of the kitchen. Mary watched the men with quiet intensity. Her great-grandfather's journal felt warm against her chest, almost as if it were alive. Inside were detailed sketches of ancient manuscripts, notes on historical authentication, and stories from his time as a scholar in the Middle East. She'd memorized every page, every illustration, every careful observation about how to spot a forgery. As John's gold-plated pen hovered over the signature line, Mary's gaze fixed on the document. Something wasn't right. The texture, the ink, the calligraphy, details that the businessmen in their expensive suits had overlooked, but that jumped out at her trained eye. Her heart began to race as she realized what she was seeing. The girl shifted slightly, trying to get a better look, and the floorboard beneath her creaked. One of the advisors glanced in her direction, his brow furrowing at the intrusion. Mary froze, pressing deeper into the shadows, but her mind continued racing. The document before them, the one about to cost John Smith a fortune, contained a fatal flaw, a mistake in its very fabric that no one else had noticed. Jennifer Smith moved through the penthouse like a shadow, her footsteps silent against the imported marble floors. She carried a crystal pitcher, refilling glasses with water that cost more per bottle than her entire grocery budget for the week. Though her uniform was pressed to perfection, the dark circles under her eyes told a different story, one of late nights and early mornings, of a life spent making other lives comfortable. "More water, sir," she asked one of John's advisors, her voice barely audible above the murmur of business talk. The man didn't even look up, just lifted his glass without breaking his conversation. Jennifer's hands, usually steady from years of balancing trays and arranging flowers, trembled slightly as she set a coaster on the gleaming table. She caught herself, steadying her breath, her face resetting into that practiced mask of polite invisibility. From her corner, Mary watched her mother work. She could read the exhaustion in the slight droop of her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes that appeared whenever Jennifer was worried about bills or rent. Yet to everyone else in the room, her mother was just furniture, functional, necessary, but not worth acknowledging. Mary tugged at the hem of her blue dress, faded from too many washes in harsh detergent. The cotton had once been vibrant, a birthday gift from 3 years ago that still fit only because Jennifer had let out the seams twice. Her brown hair was pulled back with a plain ribbon, nothing like the diamond clips that adorned the few women present at the gathering. The businessmen circled the room like sharks, their Italian suits catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. Their shoes gleamed with fresh polish, probably applied by hands like her mother's. Their laughter carried the sharp edge of people who had never worried about whether the electricity would stay on until payday. "The mineral rights alone would triple your portfolio," one man said, his gold cufflinks flashing as he gestured emphatically. Another nodded, swirling amber liquid in a tumbler. "The Allure Oasis is practically untapped. It's the investment opportunity of the decade." Mary clutched her great-grandfather's journal tighter, its worn leather comforting against her palms. She'd brought it because being in this penthouse made her feel small, and the journal reminded her that she came from something real, something true. One of the men laughed too loudly, and Jennifer flinched almost imperceptibly before continuing her rounds. Mary caught her mother's eye across the room, and Jennifer gave her the smallest of smiles, a private moment of connection in a space where they were both invisible. To these men in their expensive suits, a child in a faded dress might as well be a ghost. John Smith sat at the head of the glass conference table, his posture rigid, despite the custom Italian chair designed for comfort. Not once during the evening had a smile crossed his face. The weight of 5 generations of Smith business acumen pressed down on his shoulders, making the 63-year-old businessman appear a decade older under the soft recessed lighting of his penthouse. Around him, 4 advisors in matching charcoal suits leaned in periodically, whispering calculations and projections. Their voices created a constant hum of reassurance that failed to ease the tension evident in John's jawline. His eyes repeatedly drifted to the space at the center of the table, where the ancient parchment would soon rest, a land deed that promised to unlock mineral rights worth billions in an untapped oasis region. The document represented more than just profit. It was redemption for recent investment missteps that had caused whispers among his peers. "The markets are uncertain, but this acquisition transcends market fluctuations," murmured Michael Brown, his chief advisor of 15 years. The man adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, sliding another prospectus toward his employer. The geological surveys confirmed deposits that would secure the Smith legacy for another century. John merely nodded, his attention drawn to the elevator doors as they slid open with a soft chime. Robert Johnson strode into the penthouse as if he already owned it. Standing 6'3", with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair, he commanded attention without effort. His tailored navy suit bore the subtle hallmarks of European craftsmanship, and his Italian leather shoes reflected the overhead lights with each confident step. A Patek Philippe watch glinted on his wrist, understated wealth that spoke volumes to those trained to notice such things. "John, my friend," Robert called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned salesman. His smile, dazzling and camera-ready, never quite connected with his calculating gray eyes. He carried a sleek leather briefcase like it contained the crown jewels, his knuckles white against the handle, the only betrayal of the casual confidence he projected. The businessman extended his hand across the table, and John rose to accept it. Robert's handshake was firm, lingering just long enough to establish dominance. "The traffic in this city is criminal," he remarked with practiced casualness. "But for what we're about to accomplish, I'd have crawled here if necessary." He chuckled, setting his briefcase on the table with reverence. "History and fortune await us, John. By morning, you'll control resources that kings once went to war over." John's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes flickered, a desperate hope that the man before him truly held the key to saving everything he had built. Robert Johnson barely glanced at Jennifer Smith as he handed her his coat, treating the exchange like an afterthought. His cashmere overcoat, worth more than her monthly salary, landed heavily in her arms. "Let's keep distractions to a minimum tonight," he remarked, his tone cutting through the air like a blade wrapped in silk. His eyes never quite met hers, as if acknowledging her humanity might somehow diminish his own importance. Jennifer's spine straightened instinctively, her shoulders squaring against the weight of his dismissal. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Years of service had taught her when words were useless weapons. Instead, she nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, and stepped backward. Within moments, she had melted into the background, becoming part of the penthouse's expensive furnishings, present but unseen. Mary watched her mother retreat, noting how she seemed to make herself smaller, how she faded into the shadows with practiced ease. The girl clutched her great-grandfather's journal tighter against her chest, its worn leather cover warm against her fingers. She shrank further into her corner, behind a massive potted palm, wishing she could disappear entirely. The tension in the room had shifted with Robert's arrival. The air felt heavier, charged with something that made Mary's skin prickle. The businessmen moved differently now, their gestures more deliberate, their voices more carefully modulated. It reminded her of nature documentaries, where predators circled each other before a fight. John Smith sat at the head of the marble table, his shoulders carrying the invisible weight of decisions yet unmade. For a brief moment, his tired eyes flickered toward Mary's hiding spot. Unlike Robert, his gaze found her directly, acknowledging her presence with a brief, kind look, a small crack in the armor of power and wealth. The unexpected connection made Mary freeze. No one ever noticed her during these meetings. She was supposed to be invisible, just like her mother. Yet something in John's expression suggested recognition, perhaps even understanding. It was gone almost instantly, swallowed by the tension that permeated the room as Robert took his seat at the table. "Shall we begin?" Robert's voice commanded attention, drawing all eyes to him. "I believe we have a future to forge tonight, gentlemen." The spell broken, Mary pressed herself deeper into the shadows. Whatever brief humanity John had shown was now buried beneath the business at hand. The girl remained still, watching and waiting as the men prepared to discuss fortunes beyond her comprehension. The meeting began in earnest as Robert Johnson placed his sleek leather briefcase on the marble table with practiced precision. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on his movements. With theatrical deliberation, he entered the combination and lifted the lid, revealing a document nestled in custom-fitted velvet. "Gentlemen," Robert announced, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "I present to you the original deed to the Allure Oasis." He carefully lifted the parchment with gloved hands, unrolling it with the delicacy one might afford a newborn child. The document lay before them, its edges artfully frayed, the parchment yellowed to the perfect shade of antiquity. Intricate Arabic script flowed across its surface in elegant lines, culminating in a heavy crimson wax seal that gleamed under the penthouse lights. A collective gasp swept through the room. John Smith's advisors leaned forward, abandoning all pretense of professional detachment. Their eyes gleamed with naked greed as they beheld what they believed was their ticket to unimaginable wealth. "This deed," Robert continued, his finger hovering just above the surface without touching it, "grants exclusive mineral rights to one of the most resource-rich parcels in the entire region. Our geological surveys confirm deposits worth billions, not millions, gentlemen, billions." The businessmen exchanged glances, mental calculations practically visible in their expressions. Michael Brown, John's most trusted advisor, adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to examine the seal. "The authentication papers are impeccable," Robert added, sliding a folder across the table. "3 independent experts have verified its provenance. The carbon dating places it precisely in the 17th century. From her corner, Mary Smith watched the performance with quiet intensity, her great-grandfather's journal clutched tightly against her chest. she noticed how Robert's confidence seemed to fill the entire room, pushing against the walls, suffocating any trace of doubt. The sands of the Allure Oasis will turn to gold in your hands, the silver-haired man promised, painting vivid pictures of desert landscapes transformed into industrial marvels. Fortunes made overnight, a legacy that will outlast generations. Even John, who had maintained a weary skepticism throughout the evening, sat up straighter in his chair. The businessman's expression remained guarded, but Mary could see hope flickering in his gaze, a dangerous spark that threatened to override his usual caution. Jennifer Smith moved silently along the perimeter of the room, refilling water glasses, her presence barely acknowledged by the men whose attention remained fixed on the yellowed parchment. Only Mary noticed how her mother's hands trembled slightly as she worked, sensing the weight of the moment that was unfolding before them. Jennifer moved silently around the table, collecting empty coffee cups on a silver tray. Her practiced hands worked efficiently, barely making a sound as she approached Mary's corner. The child pressed herself further into the shadows, clutching her great-grandfather's journal against her chest like armor. One of Robert's associates, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a gaudy gold ring that caught the light with every gesture, tracked Jennifer's movements with narrowed eyes. As she reached for his cup, he deliberately placed his hand over it. "Careful, lady," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "That document's worth more than your whole life." His gaze flicked dismissively over her simple uniform. "Probably worth more than your next 10 generations." The room fell silent for a beat. Jennifer's cheeks drained of color, but her posture remained rigid, her face a carefully composed mask that revealed nothing of the humiliation burning beneath. Without a word, she gave a small nod and retreated toward the kitchen, her footsteps quickening slightly, the only sign of her distress. Mary watched her mother disappear, anger flaring hot in her chest. Her fingers tightened around the worn leather binding of the journal, its faded gold lettering barely visible after decades of loving use. The men around the table resumed their conversation, as if nothing had happened, as if her mother were invisible. $250 million is just the starting point, Robert said, leaning forward with predatory eagerness. The mineral rights alone will triple that within 5 years. John nodded thoughtfully, his expression guarded as he studied the parchment. The businessmen spoke of numbers that seemed unreal to Mary. Figures with too many zeros, percentages, projections, and market shares. Words like exclusive rights and historical precedent floated across the room. Mary closed her eyes briefly, remembering her great-grandfather's weathered face as he'd shown her the journal for the first time. His voice, accented but clear, echoed in her memory. "Dignity is a fortress, little star. Don't let them breach its walls." She ran her thumb over the journal's spine, feeling the familiar crack in the leather binding. Inside were pages of careful observations, sketches of ancient artifacts, and notes in both English and Arabic, a lifetime of scholarship dismissed by men who saw only dollar signs. The child watched as greed transformed the faces around the table, making them animated and hungry. Even John, usually reserved and thoughtful, leaned forward with interest as Robert outlined the potential returns. Only Mary noticed how the supposed ancient document seemed too perfect, too convenient, its very existence a miracle that promised to make everyone in the room even richer than they already were. Robert Johnson carefully unfolded the parchment across the polished table, his manicured fingers treating the document with theatrical reverence. The room fell silent as the supposed ancient deed to the Allure Oasis was revealed in full. Mary Smith watched from her shadowed corner, her great-grandfather's journal clutched protectively against her chest. Something immediately caught her attention. The parchment looked wrong. Mary had spent countless hours poring over the illustrations in her great-grandfather's journal, learning about authentic historical documents. Real vellum from centuries ago should have an organic quality, uneven thickness, occasional thin spots where the animal skin had been scraped too aggressively, perhaps even tiny holes or natural imperfections. This parchment was suspiciously uniform, too perfect, too manufactured. This document, Robert announced grandly to the assembled businessmen, has survived wars, colonization, and the desert itself to bring us here today. Mary squinted, studying the ink from across the room. Her great-grandfather had taught her about iron gall ink, the standard for important documents for over 1,000 years. It started black, but aged to a rich brown, often eating into the paper itself, creating distinctive halos around the letters as centuries passed. The acid in the ink would slowly burn through the material, leaving characteristic marks that no modern forgery could replicate. But the ink on Robert's document was too pristine, too black, too crisp. It sat on the surface like a modern printing, without the distinctive interaction between ancient ink and material that time inevitably produced. John Smith leaned forward, his expression serious as he examined what he believed might be his future. The advisors crowded around, murmuring appreciatively, none of them noticing what the 10-year-old girl in the corner could see so clearly. Mary remembered afternoons spent with her great-grandfather's weathered hands, guiding hers across the pages of his journal. "Look here," he would say, pointing to photographs of authentic documents. "See how the ink bites into the parchment? How it fades unevenly? That's how you know it's real. That's how you know it has lived through history." The document before them hadn't lived through anything. It was as dead as the promises Robert was making. Jennifer Smith glanced nervously at her daughter from across the room, silently pleading with her to remain invisible. But Mary couldn't look away from the fraud unfolding before her eyes. The weight of her great-grandfather's knowledge pressed against her chest, along with his journal. The fake document gleamed under the penthouse lights, beautiful and dangerous, a $250 million lie that only a child could see through. John Smith reached for his gold-plated pen, the weight of $250 million hanging on his signature. The ornate writing instrument gleamed under the penthouse's recessed lighting as he positioned it above the ancient-looking document. His financial advisors leaned forward in anticipation, their collective breath held as if witnessing a historic moment. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. From her corner, she could see the document clearly now, the yellowed parchment, the elaborate seal at the bottom with its family crest, and the flowing line of Arabic calligraphy that seemed to dance across the page. But something about that calligraphy made her stomach tighten. Her great-grandfather had spent hours teaching her the evolution of Arabic script, showing her how certain letters changed over centuries. The detail jumping out at her now was subtle, something only someone with intimate knowledge of historical linguistics would notice. The businessmen in their tailored suits remained oblivious, their eyes fixed on the fortune about to be secured. Robert Johnson stood with his shoulders back, a barely concealed smile of triumph playing at the corners of his mouth. His fingers tapped lightly against his expensive leather briefcase, the rhythm betraying his eagerness. Once signed, Robert announced to the room, "The mineral rights to the Allure Oasis will be exclusively yours, John. The geological surveys confirm deposits worth far more than our agreed price." The wealthy businessman nodded, his face a mask of careful consideration. The tip of his pen hovered just above the signature line, casting a tiny shadow on the document that would cement his legacy. Jennifer returned to the room, carrying a silver tray with a fresh pot of coffee. Her footsteps were measured and quiet as she navigated between the powerful men. She set the tray down with practiced precision, though Mary noticed how her mother's hands trembled slightly. The housekeeper's eyes darted briefly to her daughter, then to her employer, sensing the gravity of the moment unfolding. A heavy silence descended upon the penthouse, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock and the almost imperceptible scratch of John's pen as it hovered above the paper. The air felt charged, as if the very molecules had frozen in anticipation. Mary clutched her great-grandfather's journal tighter, its worn leather cover pressing into her palms. The girl knew what she was seeing, what no one else in this room full of educated, wealthy men had noticed. The question burning in her mind wasn't whether she was right, but whether she dared to speak. Mary's mind raced as she watched the scene unfold before her. She was just the maid's daughter, a child no one in this room of power and wealth would ever listen to. Her fingers tightened around her great-grandfather's journal, its worn leather offering little comfort against the weight of what she was witnessing. The pen in John Smith's hand hovered over the document, ready to release millions into the hands of a liar. As the gold-plated pen finally touched the paper, panic surged through Mary's small body. Without thinking, her elbow knocked against a crystal water glass perched on the side table beside her. The expensive vessel tumbled through the air in what felt like slow motion before shattering against the polished marble floor. The sound exploded through the penthouse like a gunshot, slicing through the tense silence. Every head in the room snapped toward the source of the disruption. Robert Johnson's face contorted with undisguised fury, his earlier charm evaporating instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, eyes blazing with rage. "Control your child!" His voice carried the edge of someone whose carefully constructed plans were suddenly at risk. Jennifer rushed across the room toward her daughter, her face a mask of mortification and terror. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she gripped Mary's shoulders, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Please, sweetheart, go to the kitchen right now," Jennifer begged, her eyes darting nervously toward her employer and the assembled businessmen. "I'll be there in a minute. This isn't the place for you." Mary could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the advisors with their annoyed expressions, John's unreadable gaze, and Robert's burning anger. The businessmen's associates exchanged irritated glances, clearly viewing the interruption as nothing more than an inconvenience caused by staff who couldn't control their children. But something stronger than fear kept Mary rooted to the spot. The truth in her great-grandfather's journal, the knowledge in her head, and the fraud laid out before them, all combined into a force that wouldn't let her retreat. If she left now, $250 million would vanish into the hands of a conman, and no one would ever know. "I'm sorry for the glass," she said softly, but didn't move toward the kitchen as her mother pleaded with her eyes. Jennifer's grip tightened slightly, her whisper more desperate. "Mary, please." But the girl stood her ground, watching as John Smith reluctantly returned his attention to the document. The moment of truth was slipping away with each passing second. Mary looked at her mother's desperate face, the fear in Jennifer's eyes unmistakable. Around the luxurious penthouse, powerful men in tailored suits stared at her, with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright contempt. The tension in the air was palpable, like an invisible weight pressing down on her small shoulders. John Smith's face remained unreadable, his features composed into the careful mask of a businessman who had spent decades hiding his thoughts from competitors. Yet something flickered behind his eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a hint of the weariness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Mary's fingers tightened around her great-grandfather's journal, the worn leather warm against her skin. She could almost hear his voice, gentle but firm, speaking the words he'd repeated so often during their afternoons together. "Truth has a quiet voice, my little star, but it's the loudest sound in a room full of lies." Taking a shaky breath, Mary stepped forward from her corner. Her faded blue dress brushed against the marble floor as she moved toward the center of the room. Jennifer made a small, strangled sound of warning, but Mary kept walking. The businessmen fell silent, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they noticed the child's unexpected approach. Robert Johnson's face darkened with irritation, his fingers tightening around his expensive fountain pen. Mary stopped at the edge of the massive table. She stood as tall as her 10-year-old frame would allow, her chin lifted with quiet dignity despite her worn clothes and simple ribbon. For a moment, she hesitated, aware of how small she was in this world of wealth and power. Then, in flawless, formal Arabic, the language her great-grandfather had lovingly taught her since she was 5, Mary declared clearly, Hatha Muzayef. The words hung in the air, perfect in pronunciation and devastating in their simplicity. This is a fake. Her voice sliced through the tension like a blade, leaving the room frozen in its wake. Every eye fixed on the unlikely source of this defiance, a child, a servant's daughter, someone who should have been invisible, but had suddenly become the only thing anyone could see. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted, tipping away from wealth and status towards something far more powerful, the simple, unadorned truth. The room froze in a tableau of shock. The investors, men who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to their will, stared at Mary with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Their certainty, the foundation of the evening's proceedings, had been shattered by 3 words from a child they hadn't even noticed until now. Robert Johnson's jaw literally dropped, his perfectly crafted mask of confidence cracking for just an instant. A flicker of panic darted across his features, there and gone in a heartbeat, before he recovered with practiced ease, his face rearranging into a contemptuous sneer. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, gesturing dismissively toward Mary. "Are we really going to let a child interrupt business of this magnitude?" His voice carried the practiced tone of a man accustomed to brushing away inconvenient truths. Jennifer stood paralyzed near the coffee service, her face drained of color. In 10 years of raising her daughter, she'd never heard Mary speak a single word of Arabic. Not one phrase, not even in play. The language had flowed from the girl's lips with the natural cadence of a native speaker, the formal tones precise and confident. Jennifer's mind raced, trying to understand where, when, how her daughter could have learned this without her knowledge. But across the table, John Smith's reaction was entirely different. His head lifted slowly, the wariness in his posture vanishing as his eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp focus. The businessman who had built an empire through instinct and insight recognized something genuine amidst the evening's carefully orchestrated deception. He studied Mary, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, not as the invisible child of his housekeeper, but as a person in her own right. The girl in the faded blue dress, standing straight despite the weight of every powerful gaze in the room, clutching that battered old journal like armor. "Everyone be quiet," John commanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun to ripple around the table. The room fell silent instantly, the power of wealth making itself felt. He leaned forward, elbows on the polished table, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes never left Mary as he addressed her directly, bypassing the adults, the advisors, the experts who had failed to see what she had noticed. In that moment, the dynamic of the entire room shifted. The invisible became visible. The powerless held power. The child who had been dismissed by everyone suddenly commanded the attention of one of the wealthiest men in America. "Tell me more," John said simply, his voice devoid of condescension. For the first time that evening, he spoke not as a titan of industry, but as a man who recognized truth when he heard it. The silence that followed Mary's declaration was suffocating, as if all the oxygen had been sucked from the penthouse's rarefied air. The weight of what hung in the balance, the deal, the fortune, the very future of the Smith legacy, seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders. John Smith set his gold-plated pen on the marble table with deliberate care, the soft click echoing in the stillness. He ignored the protests already bubbling from Robert's lips and the concerned murmurs rippling through his circle of advisors. "Everyone, quiet," John commanded, his voice level but carrying unmistakable authority. The muttering investors fell silent immediately. His gaze never left the small figure standing before him, this child whom everyone had overlooked until now. "What did you say?" he asked Mary, his tone neither dismissive nor patronizing, but genuinely curious. Mary straightened her shoulders, her faded blue dress a stark contrast to the expensive suits surrounding her. "It's a fake," she repeated in English, her voice unwavering despite the powerful men staring her down. "That whole thing is a lie." Jennifer Smith stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, her face drained of color, terror evident in her wide eyes. She took a hesitant step toward her daughter, clearly torn between maternal protection and professional survival. "This is absurd," Robert Johnson sputtered, his carefully cultivated charm cracking to reveal the fury beneath. "Are we seriously going to listen to a child? A servant's child?" His face had turned an alarming shade of red, veins prominent at his temples as he gestured wildly at the ancient-looking parchment. "This document has been authenticated by experts." The room had physically split, as if an invisible line had been drawn across the polished floor. On one side stood Robert, indignant and increasingly desperate, flanked by his associates who shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. On the other side was John, silent and calculating, his faith in his highly paid experts visibly shaken by a 10-year-old's conviction. Michael Brown leaned toward his employer. "Sir, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," he suggested quietly, eyeing Mary with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. John ignored him, his focus entirely on the girl clutching the worn journal to her chest. Something in her steady gaze, in the certainty with which she stood her ground, despite being surrounded by wealth and power she could scarcely comprehend, resonated with him. "Tell me why you think it's fake," he said, silencing Robert's renewed protests with a sharp gesture. "I want to hear what she has to say." The businessman's words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward, changing everything. In that moment, the balance of power shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Robert Johnson leapt to his feet, his carefully cultivated charm evaporating in an instant. His face flushed crimson as he slammed his palm against the polished marble table. "Are you going to let a servant's brat ruin the deal of a lifetime?" he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. The other investors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, exchanging uncertain glances. The atmosphere in the penthouse, once thick with anticipation, now crackled with tension. John Smith remained perfectly still, his attention completely diverted from the angry businessman. His gaze had locked onto Mary and the worn journal she clutched protectively against her chest. The leather binding was cracked with age, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from decades of careful study. "Prove it," John said softly, his words falling like a judge's gavel in the suddenly silent room. The balance of power wavered visibly. The circle of wealthy men who had been so certain of their position moments before now found themselves waiting for a 10-year-old girl to speak. Michael Brown leaned forward, his normally impassive face betraying a flicker of curiosity. Across the room, Jennifer trembled as she watched the scene unfold. Her hands twisted the edge of her uniform, knuckles white with tension. She was certain they were about to lose everything: her job, their tiny apartment, perhaps even their dignity. One didn't challenge men like Robert Johnson without consequences. She opened her mouth to apologize, to drag Mary away before more damage could be done. But Mary stepped forward before her mother could intervene, her small shoulders squared, her resolve unbroken. The faded blue dress she wore seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the quiet authority in her stance. "I can show you exactly what's wrong with it," she said, her voice clear despite its softness. Robert's associates began to mutter among themselves. One laughed nervously, trying to dispel the growing unease. "This is absurd. We've had experts authenticate this document." "Experts you paid," John replied without looking away from Mary. He gestured toward the ancient-looking parchment spread across the table. "Come here, child. Show me what you see." Jennifer took a halting step forward, protective instinct warring with fear. "Mr. Smith, please, she's just—" "Let her speak," John interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "I want to hear what she has to say." Mary glanced at her mother, a silent reassurance passing between them. Before approaching the massive table, where millions of dollars, and perhaps something far more valuable, hung in the balance, Mary approached the massive mahogany table, her small frame barely tall enough for her chin to clear its polished surface. The circle of men in expensive suits looked down at her, some with contempt, others with curiosity, all with disbelief. In their world of power and wealth, she was an insect, an anomaly, an impossibility. John Smith leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable but attentive. The room fell into a tense silence as Mary carefully placed her great-grandfather's journal on the table. The worn leather binding stood in stark contrast to the sleek modern furnishings of the penthouse. "Go ahead," John said, his voice gentler than before. Mary took a deep breath. Feeling Jennifer's anxious presence behind her, the child's voice emerged calm but clear, echoing in the hushed room. "Real vellum from the 17th century is hand-scraped animal skin," she began, pointing to the document. "It's always uneven in thickness because of the manual process. You can see through thinner spots when held to light." She gestured toward the parchment. "This paper is machine-made, too perfect, too uniform throughout." Robert shifted uncomfortably, his confident facade beginning to crack. One of the advisors exchanged glances with Michael, who had stopped typing notes on his device. "The ink is wrong too," Mary continued, her finger hovering above the document without touching it. Authentic documents from that period used iron gall ink, which reacts with the parchment over centuries. It fades to brown and actually burns into the page, leaving tiny halos around the letters and sometimes even holes where the acid ate through. The businessmen leaned closer, several now examining the document with newfound scrutiny. "This ink just sits on top of the surface," she explained. "It's too black, too crisp. There's no corrosion pattern at all." Jennifer watched from behind, her hands clasped tightly together, a mixture of fear and pride washing over her face as her daughter spoke with such authority. Mary turned a page in her great-grandfather's journal, revealing detailed sketches of ancient documents alongside notes in faded pencil. "My great-grandfather was a conservator at the Metropolitan Museum. He taught me how to spot fakes." The weight of her words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Robert's increasingly agitated breathing and the distant hum of New York traffic far below the penthouse windows. John looked from the child to the document, then back again, his eyes narrowing as he began to see what had been invisible to him and his team of experts just moments before. As Mary continued her explanation, the room fell into a stunned silence. The investors exchanged nervous glances, doubt creeping into their expressions like shadows at dusk. The child's confidence was unnerving. This wasn't the rambling of an attention-seeking girl, but the precise analysis of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. "The biggest mistake is in the calligraphy," Mary said, her small finger pointing directly at the ornate wax seal. In 17th century Kufic script, the letter Fa used a small inverted V, not a dot. She opened her great-grandfather's journal to a bookmarked page showing examples of ancient Arabic calligraphy. The dot didn't appear until a century later. Whoever made this got the date of the dot wrong. The silence that followed was thunderous, a vacuum of sound where even breathing seemed too loud. John Smith stared at the document, then at the child, his mind racing to process the implications. Everything he'd been about to invest in, his entire future strategy, had been balanced on the authenticity of this parchment. Robert Johnson's face drained of color, transforming from confident businessman to cornered prey in seconds. His elaborate plan, likely months or years in the making, was unraveling because of a 10-year-old girl and a single dot of ink. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged, only a strangled sound of protest. That's absurd," one of the investors finally sputtered, though his voice lacked conviction. "How could a child possibly know such a thing?" Jennifer stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, her hands clasped tightly together, watching her daughter stand her ground against these powerful men. Pride and fear battled within her. Pride at Mary's courage and knowledge, fear of the consequences. John leaned forward, examining the document more carefully. His eyes narrowed as he studied the calligraphy that Mary had pointed out. Though he couldn't read Arabic, he could see the inconsistency she'd highlighted, a small detail that would have cost him millions. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, addressing Mary directly for the first time, "you've just saved me from making a catastrophic mistake." His gaze shifted to Robert, hardening with each passing second. "And you have some explaining to do." Robert's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass, knocking it over in his haste. The liquid spread across the table, seeping toward the document, perhaps intentionally, but John quickly snatched the parchment away, preserving the evidence of deception. "I think," John said, his voice dangerously quiet, "we need to verify this claim immediately." He looked at Mary with newfound respect. "And I believe we have our expert right here." The room fell into a tense silence. John Smith straightened his back, his expression hardening into the look that had made him a titan of industry. Without taking his eyes off the ancient document, he beckoned to his advisor. "Michael, bring me my reading glasses and the magnifying glass from my study." Michael Brown nodded sharply and hurried from the room, his footsteps barely audible on the plush carpet. The investors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances while Robert stood frozen, his confident facade beginning to crack around the edges. John leaned forward, studying the parchment with new eyes. The child's observations had ignited something in him, a cold, calculating fire that burned away the fog of hope and wishful thinking. He traced his finger just above the surface, careful not to touch the document, following the path Mary had outlined with her simple, devastating logic. When Michael returned, he carried a leather case containing John's custom-made spectacles and an antique brass magnifying glass with an ivory handle, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Smiths. The businessman slipped on his glasses and took the magnifying instrument, hunching over the document with methodical precision. "The texture," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Machine perfect." His gaze moved to the ink, sitting on the surface, then to the seal and its calligraphy. The dot. Jennifer stood behind her daughter, hands resting protectively on Mary's shoulders. The girl remained perfectly still, her chin lifted slightly, watching as her observations were confirmed by the powerful man who minutes earlier had barely acknowledged her existence. After several excruciating minutes of examination, John looked up, his eyes cold as winter steel. "Michael, get Professor Omar Davis on the secure line, now." The advisor pulled out his smartphone and stepped to the side, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Robert attempted to interject, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "John, surely you're not taking the word of a child over experts who have verified." "Silence." The single word, spoken quietly but with absolute authority, cut through Robert's protest like a blade. "We'll let Columbia University's head of antiquities settle this matter." Michael returned, nodding. "Professor Davis is connecting now, sir." John gestured toward the large screen on the wall. "Put him through. I want him to examine this document inch by inch." As the display flickered to life, the faces around the table reflected a spectrum of emotions: fear, doubt, anger, hope. But John's expression remained unreadable, his focus absolute as he prepared to discover whether the maid's daughter had just saved him from making a $250 million mistake. The penthouse fell silent as Professor Omar Davis appeared on the large screen mounted on the far wall. The renowned antiquities expert sat in his book-lined office at Columbia University, surrounded by ancient manuscripts and reference texts. The harsh light of his desk lamp cast dramatic shadows across his thoughtful face, highlighting the gray at his temples and the intensity in his eyes. "I apologize for the late hour," John said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had nearly lost everything. "We need your expertise on an urgent matter." The professor adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "What do you have for me, John?" Michael positioned the camera to capture the document while John explained the situation in measured tones. Mary stood beside her mother, Jennifer's protective arm around her shoulders. As all eyes alternated between the screen and the parchment, Professor Omar's expression remained neutral as he examined the deed, directing Michael to zoom in on specific sections. The ink, now the seal, the fiber pattern, the calligraphy at the bottom. His silence stretched painfully as he made notes, the scratching of his pen audible through the speakers. Robert shifted his weight from one foot to another, his earlier confidence evaporating with each passing second. His associates exchanged nervous glances as beads of sweat formed on their foreheads. "Could you focus on the signature once more?" the professor requested, his voice betraying nothing. Michael complied, hands steady despite the tension filling the room. The investors held their breath. Jennifer squeezed Mary's shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly. John sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving the screen. After what felt like an eternity, Professor Omar straightened in his chair and removed his glasses. His verdict came with the calm authority of decades of scholarship. "This is a very competent forgery, but a forgery nonetheless." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The professor continued, pointing to specific elements on the screen. "The ink, while aged-looking, lacks the characteristic oxidation of genuine iron gall ink from that period. The texture of the parchment is too uniform for hand-processed vellum." He paused, his expression hardening. But most damning is exactly what the young lady pointed out: the dot in the Kufic script. That particular calligraphic convention didn't appear until nearly a century after this document's purported creation date. Whoever crafted this document did not truly understand the history they were attempting to replicate. The professor's words fell like a judge's gavel, final and irrefutable. Robert's face drained of color as the truth crushed his elaborate scheme beneath its weight. John turned toward Mary, newfound respect evident in his gaze. The child who had been invisible just hours before had become the most important person in the room. The verdict was final. Professor Omar's words hung in the air like a death sentence to Robert's scheme. The businessman let out a strangled protest, his voice cracking as he attempted to salvage what remained of his credibility. "This is absurd! You're taking the word of a child and some academic who isn't even here in person?" Robert Johnson's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. The investors who had been eager to join the venture moments ago now recoiled from him as if he carried something contagious. They whispered accusations, their loyalties evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "I think we've heard enough," one investor said, gathering his papers. Another closed his laptop with a decisive snap. The third simply stood and walked away without a word, his silence more damning than any accusation. John sat in stunned silence, his fingers tracing the edge of the document that had nearly cost him everything. The magnitude of what he'd almost lost, his wealth, his honor, his family's legacy, slowly sank in. $250 million would have vanished into Robert's pockets, along with the Smith family reputation that had taken generations to build. Jennifer stood frozen by the wall, her hands clasped tightly together, watching the scene unfold with wide, disbelieving eyes. Her daughter, her Mary, had just saved one of America's wealthiest men from financial ruin. The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence played out before her. "Security," John finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Two men in dark suits materialized from the hallway. "Please ensure Mr. Johnson and his associates remain comfortable until my legal team arrives." Robert's face drained of color. "John, be reasonable. We've known each other for years." "And in all those years," John interrupted, "you were planning this?" He gestured toward the forged deed. "How long have you been waiting to spring this trap?" The con man's silence was answer enough. Security moved closer, not touching him, but making escape impossible. The remaining advisors in the room began making urgent phone calls. Damage control, already in motion. Through it all, Mary remained by the table, her small hand still resting on her great-grandfather's journal. The only thing that had saved John Smith was the quiet integrity of a child no one had noticed. A child who understood that truth mattered more than power or wealth. John looked at Mary, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. In her faded blue dress and simple ribbon, she stood taller than anyone else in the room. The businessman realized that all his millions couldn't buy what this child possessed naturally: the courage to speak truth in a room full of lies. John Smith rose from his chair, the weight of realization visible in every movement. The room fell silent as the billionaire, one of America's most powerful men, approached Mary. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he bowed deeply to her, his expensive suit creasing as he showed the ultimate sign of respect to a 10-year-old girl in a faded blue dress. "Today," John said, his voice carrying across the hushed penthouse, "my honor and my fortune were saved not by my advisors or wealth, but by a child with the courage to speak the truth." The words hung in the air, transforming the atmosphere from one of business to something more profound, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended social barriers. The investors exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware of their own complicity in nearly falling for Robert's scheme. Michael Brown stood awkwardly by the table, his earlier confidence replaced by humility, as he realized a child had spotted what he, with all his expertise, had missed. Mary looked down at her shoes, unaccustomed to being the center of attention. The journal in her hands, her great-grandfather's legacy, seemed to pulse with vindication. She thought of his stories about truth and dignity, never imagining she would embody those lessons in a room full of powerful men. John turned to Jennifer, who stood frozen between pride and fear. Her world had tilted on its axis. Just minutes ago, she'd been terrified of losing her job. Now, her daughter was being honored by her employer. "Your daughter is extraordinary," John said, his tone warm and sincere. "You must be very proud." Jennifer nodded, unable to speak as tears welled in her eyes. Years of hiding in the background, of teaching Mary to be invisible, of accepting dismissive treatment, all of it crashed against this unexpected moment of recognition. "I am," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached for Mary's shoulder, drawing her daughter close. Every day. The New York skyline glittered beyond the penthouse windows, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within. The document that had nearly cost John $250 million lay discredited on the table, its elaborate deception unraveled by a child's knowledge and courage. Mary leaned against her mother, feeling the trembling in Jennifer's hand. She'd never seen her cry at work before. Jennifer had always been careful to maintain her professional mask, no matter the circumstance. But now, as the tears slipped silently down her cheeks, Mary understood that some moments deserved to break through our carefully constructed walls. With a firm nod, John Smith signaled to his security personnel. Two men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the penthouse, positioning themselves near Robert and his associates. "Please ensure our guests remain comfortable until my legal team arrives," John instructed, his voice carrying a steel edge that hadn't been present before. The con man's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of his situation. As Robert and his team were escorted to a separate room, the atmosphere in the penthouse transformed. The air, previously thick with tension and greed, now felt somehow lighter, as if a storm had passed. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the twinkling lights of New York City below, no longer seeming cold and distant, but rather celebratory. John turned to Jennifer and Mary, his expression softening. "Please," he gestured toward the plush leather chairs surrounding the coffee table. "Sit with me, not as staff, but as honored guests." Jennifer hesitated, years of professional boundaries making her uncomfortable with the invitation, but Mary's hopeful glance convinced her to accept. The businessman poured 3 glasses of water himself, a simple act that spoke volumes. "Young lady," he addressed Mary directly, "you've saved me from a catastrophic mistake tonight. My fortune, yes, but more importantly, my family's honor." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'd like to offer you a reward. A college fund, perhaps? Or anything else you might desire." Mary glanced at her mother, seeking permission to speak freely. Jennifer nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. The child turned back to John, clutching her great-grandfather's journal a little tighter. "Do you have a real library?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "With old books? Books I could learn from?" John blinked, clearly surprised by the request. Then, for the first time that evening, a genuine smile transformed his face, erasing years of worry lines. He laughed, not the practiced chuckle he used in boardrooms, but an authentic sound of delight. "I have 3 libraries," he replied. "One here, a larger collection at my home upstate, and my family's historical archive in Boston." He leaned closer to Mary, as if sharing a secret. "Some volumes date back 400 years. The child's eyes widened with wonder. John realized then that the greatest gift he could offer wasn't money, something he had in abundance, but knowledge. The very thing that had saved him tonight. In this young girl's request, he recognized something of himself, a hunger to understand the world through its history, its stories, its truths. "They're yours to explore," he promised. "All of them."